Hi, this is Alex with another Lightroom video. Just by the frequency with which I post these, you can tell that I'm not really a good YouTuber. But here we are, this time with a photo that my friend Victor from Germany sent. And he agreed that I could make a video out of developing this high contrast scene. High contrast scene means, of course, that the difference between the lightest parts of the image and the darkest parts is pretty strong. This is how the camera sees the scene and not at all how we would see this with our own human eyes. So we need to do something about this. The first thing that we need to look at when we work with these scenes is the profile. And I mentioned before that Adobe Color is a profile that has a good punch and saturation to begin with, but that means it has a certain amount of contrast that isn't beneficial when we work with an image that has too much of it already. I can show this here by activating the shadow clipping warning here by hovering my mouse over this little up arrow here at the shadows. I can also make that permanent by pressing the J key on my keyboard or by clicking on this warning icon here. Pressing the J key activates it for both, which is usually helpful. And then I can go into my profile browser or just click here to browse the favorites. I go into the profile browser to make it clearer. And you see here you have the normal Adobe RAW options, and you have a section camera matching. Camera matching are profiles that Adobe provides, and they mimic your camera's options and tone controls that would only apply if you were shooting JPEG in camera. But with Adobe's camera matching profiles, we have this available to us here for our RAW files. And you will see when I move my mouse over here to the camera flat profile, which has very little contrast, all this blue area that had no shadow detail at all disappears, or almost all of it disappears, simply because the profile doesn't render the shadows so dark. So this is a much better starting point. You see here I have this highlighted star on it, which means it's a favorite, and that profile in fact appears here in my list of favorites, where I can define the profiles that I want to show up here that I use most often. So camera flat is the better starting point because it gives me more shadow detail here. And you see also that my highlights here are not as sharply defined anymore. If I switch back to Adobe Color, you see these highlights are brighter too here. So it's very beneficial to start with a flatter profile if you have a high contrast scene, which is exactly this. Of course, we want to inspect the quality of the data in here, and it's quite amazing when I set the exposure compensation here to +4. You can see I have a lot of detail here in the shadows, and it isn't even too noisy, or rather the noise doesn't have such a negative impact here because this is a lot of fine detail that kind of camouflages the noise that we see here. Here in the leaves it becomes a little bit more obvious. We could use an enhance and AI denoise on those areas if it would really bother us, but I think that's not a problem. Back to our starting point though at 0. The next thing we want to look at is the white balance here, and I happen to know that these 4550K are a little bit too cool for the Nikon Z6. How did I determine that? I set my Z6 to a daylight or sunny white balance in the camera instead of auto white balance, and then made an exposure and imported that raw file into Lightroom, and then the as shot white balance will show me what Nikon suggests to use as a daylight color temperature for a photograph, and that happens to be 5000K and +6. And that gives me this little bit of a magenta glow here in the sky already, which looks much more like a sunset now and has a better color rendition than the -14 that the camera's auto white balance chose. In fact, that -14 might be the result of the camera attempting to neutralize that glow that is actually in the sky here. So we adjust our profile and we adjust a white balance, and then we're already off to a much better start. Now obviously we need to increase the exposure of this picture because the shadows here aren't even that well represented in the histogram at present. This is all in the blacks here. If I move the shadow slider, not too much is happening. By moving that out into a range where the shadows actually are with a +1 stop, this slider will have more of an effect and I can adjust my shadows better here. I don't want to go too far with this just yet because we're making global adjustments right now and we can fine-tune those with local adjustments. After applying a +1 exposure compensation here, my sky is getting a bit too bright. Now I could begin with sky masking and whatnot, but since this highlight area is pretty much only in the sky anyway, I might as well just reduce the highlights here globally to bring that into a better range that I can more easily work with. Now I have a rendition that helps me to evaluate the image as a whole, what's in there and what do I perhaps want to do. And obviously one thing here is this cut of tree at the edge. That is a little bit of a distraction, and then these utility covers here at the bottom of the frame as well. That railing might arguably be an element too, but I think that makes more sense as an element here because there's a trail going in here, so that is acceptable to me. Might be an individual thing, of course. So I go into my crop tool and my pet peeve, set a precise 2:3 aspect ratio. You see Nikon Z6 has a couple of extra pixels here on the sides. And then I simply crop in from the bottom right here to get rid of the tree, maybe a little bit more like so, to also avoid most of that reflection here. And it also takes care of one of these utility covers here already. Great, done with cropping. Now let's look at these distractions here. 2 more utility covers, actually 3. And I want to remove those, so I go to my heal tool, and one would think that the very new content aware remove would do the best job here simply by sampling the surrounding areas here, but it kind of looks odd because it seems to take more from the trail here than from these grasses. So I could instruct it by pressing Command or on Windows Control to sample more from here, but even then I have a transition here. That round shape of my selection here still appears. I find that quite odd. And the old heal tool that has been available for such a long time does a much better job if I just move the source area over here, and then I have a more seamless transition here between my patch and the correction area. And I do the same thing here for this utility cover, and maybe I need to adjust that and move that up here, just match it up with the trail a little bit. And then the last one with an extra distraction is here. Get rid of that as well, because attention to detail matters. There, that looks pretty good. If you don't know that this stuff is there, you hardly see it anymore, right? Well, maybe the bottom one too much. That can be adjusted a little bit. There you go. That's better. Now these lines line up properly. That looks more natural. Okay. Now when we look at this, the sky is here, bright here, and it's kind of a connection here. It does seem to illuminate those group of trees here. The best indication for that is this reflection of light here off of these tree branches, but not too much of that is actually coming out. Let me disable that overlay here. So I want to bring some more light in here to really emphasize that there was this twilight sky that was casting some light here onto this landscape still. I do that with a local adjustment, of course. I can test the effect that I intend to use quickly by making a global adjustment. That will be clarity here in this case, and you see that has a nice effect here on the fine detail, brings out more of this. But obviously I don't want to use clarity here. You see it makes this rendition of the trees rather hard, so I want to keep that area here soft and use my clarity only here. I do that with a simple brush and with my preset clarity, which sets it to -99. We want to set it to +100. I'm going to stop brushing, but I also add whites to this. I found that brushing in whites to darker areas combined with clarity has a very, very nice effect. My brush is set to a flow of only 50. Maybe I want to reduce that even more to just 30. I can do that by just pressing the corresponding number key on my keyboard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 sets the flow in intervals of 10 here. So I press 3 to go to 30, press 5 to go to 50. Then I begin brushing. And with this low flow, I can brush over an area multiple times to slowly build up that effect. Press and hold my left mouse button and I begin to brush, and you see here these little flowers come out nicely. Maybe I don't want to do too much on the side of the trail here where that's actually just dry grass. And I can continue brushing into the other areas here and bring out the detail in the trees and in the leaves here. In the places where it's beneficial, I want to open up this corner here a little bit with detail. That looks great. And of course it needs to continue back here along this river bank perhaps, where there's more greens. Just brushing in very, very slowly, multiple brush strokes until the effect builds up. Here we go. That looks really nice. Need to open this up here too. That's looking good. Okay. Maybe I even want to brush a little bit of that onto the water surface here to enhance the reflection here that we have in the sky. Wonderful. And a little bit back here to bring those fields up to just a tiny bit. You see, I adjust the size of my brush on the go here with my mouse wheel. It's very helpful to have a wheel mouse when you apply these kind of edits. Okay, that looks neat. Now let's take a look at some details here. When we were adjusting the highlights and the shadows, we introduced some artifacts here where the sky that's inside of those trees is still brighter. Because Lightroom doesn't detect the difference here very well, it considers these small areas as shadow and lightens them up with the shadows, and that looks a little bit odd here, so we don't want to do that, and we want to fix that here. I use another brush for that, and I have a brush preset that I call the Highlight Tamer, which is kind of a silly name. What it does is it reduces the exposure by half a stop, it reduces the highlights, and also uses clarity of -50. Negative clarity renders small highlights softer. I set my flow to 50 for this here. It's the same trick, just pressing the 5 key. But it's not a trick, it's a keyboard shortcut. And then I just brush over these small spots here to make these darker so that I have a better transition here between the trees and the sky. That's not distracting in any way. Needs more brushing here in those spots, and there's a very bright spot here where I brush over as well. If I really needed to, I could fine-tune this and then subtract the greens from it, but I find this adjustment here affects mostly the highlights so nicely that I don't need to bother making a refined selection. I can just brush over this to reduce those highlights here. Okay, that's great. Oh, look at that. There's a hot pixel here in those dark areas. So we want to get rid of that. Go back to our heal tool. Very small hot pixel. Click, and it's gone. Okay. Now I have reduced this sky artifacts here. Looking at it, this definitely needs a bump in color. Now I use my vibrance, and I allow myself to use quite a good amount of vibrance here because I had this camera flat profile to begin with, which has a much lower saturation than the Adobe Color profile. Just for comparison, this would be Adobe Color, much harder contrast. We're using camera flat, much more even contrast, lovely light here everywhere now, because we developed for that profile, of course. And maybe I even want to go into my white balance and make that overall a little bit warmer still and add more of this little bit of magenta tint. That looks nice. What I want to do here is reduce the brightest part of the sky just a little bit here, and I will show you why I want to do that. I use a radial gradient, and maybe I just use the highlight reduction here, -50, and I use my clarity at -50, and I just put that gradient here over that sky. Okay, I can see that's gonna be too much, but let's just adjust the size here of it. Doesn't need that much highlight adjustment. Maybe here, just a quick before and after with the eye symbol here. Yeah, that's good. I like that. Maybe we can drag it out even more and maybe make the center area a little bit bigger. Okay, that's good. So now I have this, and I don't want it to affect those fields here where I previously brushed in a little bit. So I'm gonna intersect this mask with the sky so that it's only applied in the area where the radial gradient and the sky overlap. For that, I press and hold my Alt or Option key, and these two add and subtract buttons change to intersect. And I can choose select sky, and now Lightroom detects the sky, and the resulting mask is one that only includes the sky and the radial gradient where they overlap. Radial gradient intersected with sky results in this mask. Before and after, I brought a little bit of that brightest part of the sky down here this way. Why did I do that? Look at the histogram here now. If I turn this mask off, you see these highlights here reach all the way into the whites right now. With the mask on, I've reduced this considerably, and now I can open up these whites here with a global adjustment, and that adds a beautiful amount of punch to this sunset sky. And it also further affects the area where I previously brushed in some of this effect. Looking at that now, I think the difference here between the trail and those flowers is a bit too much, so I should probably go back to that mask and set the flow really low again. At least brush a little bit over that trail here so that its brightness matches up with those flowers. And I need to go in here as well. There, that looks much more natural now, I think. Okay, so we haven't touched any global adjustments for the presence here, and I think that's good. But one thing that we could try when we have high contrast images is to use negative dehaze. That is another way to fill in shadows. I'm gonna just apply a little bit of this, and you see everything gets softer here, and it's like opening up the shadows even more. Everything gets a little bit glowy now too, and maybe a little bit too warm. Dehaze has an effect on the colors, so I might want to play with that, maybe reduce that a little bit. I think here is a good point for this. Everything looks nice and soft, opened up the deepest shadows further with our negative dehaze. I don't want to use a shadow slider for this because of these artifacts that I already mentioned. Looking at the sky here, maybe I want to reduce a little bit of attention to that topmost part here as a finishing step. Another mask, a linear gradient for this. I think my preset that I have here with negative clarity and negative highlights or negative exposure should be fine. And just put that in here from the top a little bit. It's like adding a vignette just in one corner here of the sky. And here we are with a nearly finalized image. We should look at our detail panel. Maybe we can adjust the masking here a little bit. I can press and hold my Alt or Option key, and I think that looks fairly good. The parts of the sky that have no definition are pretty much masked out here. I can actually reduce it a little bit. The amount of sharpening that we apply here looks good to me too. I zoomed in, I don't see any sharpening halos, so this seems to be a good default value here. Okay. What's left is to do a quick before and after comparison. I press and hold my backslash key, that's the one under the backspace key. Here's what the image looked like before, with our shadow clipping warning on. And here's what the image looks after a very nice sunset sky with beautiful and very realistic light, the way we would see it if we would stand in this location. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video as usual. Thanks for watching. Bye.